Okay, so this is the year that you're going to be successful with your sourdough, and I'm going to help you. I've been teaching this for a really long time, and 99% of the time when people end up with large holes in their dough or in their bread after it's been baked, or if it's gummy or flat, oftentimes or almost always they say, I overproofed my dough. Well, I'm here to tell you that that's almost never the case. If you have a proper pre-ferment for your sourdough and you have a optimal bulk fermentation, it is really, really difficult to overproof your dough to the point that you end up with gummy or flat sourdough. It is almost always the case that it is underdeveloped gluten. And where does underdeveloped gluten start? It starts with your starter. It starts with your pre-ferment. So I'm going to show you today how to gauge whether or not your pre-ferment or your leaven is ready to make bread, because often people will only use and rely on the flow test, and that is a good gauge as to whether you have an active sourdough starter, but it really leaves a lot of gaps, because often people will let their sourdough go way too far and it still floats on water, so they think, well, that's going to be fine for my bread. When really, it's not active enough to actually leaven your bread in such a way that you get this beautiful structure and oven spring and nice open crumb that we're all kind of going for. So I'm going to show you how I make my leaven. I have another video on how I make my sourdough starter, how I feed my sourdough starter. I use a ratio of 50-50-10. So I do 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, and 10 grams of your starter from the previous day. The reason that I do that is because that allows me to be able to gauge exactly how much food my sourdough starter is eating. So if I keep like a giant bowl or like a container, lots of people will keep like a giant container like this big of their sourdough starter, and they just add to it every single day. The problem with that is that over time, so you need at least equal amounts of starter to your food, which is your flour. So over time, if you have a giant container like this, well, it has to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden you have like a huge mixing bowl full of sourdough starter. It just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. You can never actually get a really active starter by keeping your sourdough starter that way. So how I like to do it is I like to feed just into a small little jar, and again, I have another video on exactly how I do that. And the reason that I like that is because then I know exactly how much food my starter is getting. So it gets to eat and grow and eat and grow and eat and grow 5 times. So 5-to-1 ratio. I use the exact same ratio when I'm making my pre-ferment or my leaven for my dough. So this is a leaven. This is just a large feed of a sourdough starter. I'm going to use this entire thing when I make my dough later. So I'm going to show you in a little bit exactly how to do that, how to make your leaven, and how to gauge whether or not it's ready. So obviously this one's ready, and I'm going to show you what to look for when you're looking for your leaven being ready. But back to the ratios. If you would like to make a leaven, so let's pretend that your sourdough recipe calls for 300 grams of starter or leaven. All you have to do is divide that in half. So you need 150 grams of water, 150 grams of flour, and then you take 10% of that, so 30 grams of your sourdough starter. So this is my sourdough starter. That's exactly how I made this. Okay, so I wanted 300 grams of leaven. I took 150 water, 150 grams of flour, and then 30 grams out of this, and I put it in here and I mixed it up. And then I let it get active. You're going to use the whole entire thing in your sourdough. So that is like a super simple recipe for a leaven for any sourdough recipe that you're going to use. You literally just take how much they're calling for in the recipe and divide it in half, do equal parts flour and water, and then your 10% of your sourdough starter. So that gives you your nice big leaven that you're going to use in your sourdough dough recipe. And I'm going to show you how to make sure that your leaven is optimal for making dough, because there's no point in going forward, especially if you're new to sourdough, there's absolutely no point in moving forward in the process if your leaven is not up to par, because that is what is going to give you good fermentation in your dough. That is what is going to give you the activity and the strength in your dough and the development of your gluten. And the development of your gluten is pretty much the name of the game. So unless you have a good pre-ferment, there's no point in moving forward. So let's talk about what that looks like. I'm going to show you mine. I'm going to show you what not to use, and I'm going to show you how to make it. So first I'm going to show you examples of pre-ferments or leavens and my starters, and then I'm going to show you how to mix one up and what to do. So these two are the exact same ratios and same size jars. Okay, the difference is this was made quite a bit further in advance than this one. This one, you could say, could be used for sourdough. This is not good enough for me, and I'll show you why. So I have some water here. So this will technically float on the water, okay? Technically, you could use this for sourdough, okay? So that's one way of determining whether or not your sourdough starter is ready for bread. However, you can see here, so here are the other things that I use to gauge whether or not my sourdough is ready for bread. You can see here that it has risen all the way up to the top, okay? So you can see it came all the way up to here, just like this one did. Okay, so this one has come all the way up to the top. See how close to the top that is. So that came up to there, and it has now fallen back down. So yes, it is floating. Yes, it's active when I bang it on the counter a little bit, but it is still really quite soupy. So if I was to pour this into a jar or into a bowl, it would kind of pour out. There's not a lot of activity that you can see left in there. Okay, so again, when I hit the bottom, you can kind of see a few bubbles kind of forming on the top. But if I was to leave that alone, that's just going to keep getting flatter and flatter. So for me, like, again, it's up there. It was up there, and now it's way down here. So to me, this is not what I want to use for my sourdough. I can use it, but what I'm going to run into if I use this is I'm going to run into stickier dough. I'm going to feel like my dough needs more flour. Your dough never needs more flour when you're doing a recipe. The only reason it would need more flour is because this isn't active enough. Okay, so, and we're going to talk about that when you make your leaven too, depending on what type of starter you make your leaven with. So it always comes back to here. It always comes back to your starter, your pre-ferment, all of that. This, again, technically, it floats on water. It's still floating on the water, by the way. It's still floating. Theoretically, this is usable for your dough. This isn't good enough for me. I would use this as discard or make a pizza with it or make cinnamon rolls or something different. I would not make bread with this. It will just be frustrating for me, especially if you're new to sourdough. This one, it doesn't have any streaks, so it hasn't fallen back down at all. It's not even quite to the peak yet because you'll see how it deflates like that, and I can kind of tilt it. We're gonna tilt this up a little bit. You can see how it's kind of like stretching away from the sides of the jar there. See how much stretch that has? How many strands of gluten you can like really see in there? That is what I want my starter and my ferment to look like before I make my bread. That's exactly what I'm going for. So this has risen up. This is called a young leaven. So it has come to the peak, and it has started to pillow, but this will sit like this probably for like another, I could say probably another hour because my home is quite chilly. I could probably get another hour out of that and it not have fallen too much back down. So I still have some time with this one. This one could sit. Basically what you're looking for is when I bang this on the counter like I just did, if I was to cover this back up and leave it, it's gonna rise back up again. There's still so much activity left in there that's gonna rise back up again. This is what I want for my dough. This is going to have so much strength. You can see the gluten strength in there for what I need for my sourdough in order to leaven it properly. So that is what I'm looking for, not this. You'll see when I stretch this from the side of the jar, like there's a little bit in there that's stretching, but really not much. Okay, so this is what you want to look for. Not floating. Obviously, this one's going to float on the water too. That one's still floating over there. That's not really what you're looking for. You're looking for the consistency of the rising of the jar. You're not looking for streaks where it's fallen back down from the jar. This was its peak. It's now down here. So your starter can float on water for a really long time and not necessarily be strong enough to leaven your bread optimally. Okay, so now I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna teach you how to get it to look like this. All right, so here's 3 examples of a sourdough starter. You're making your pre-ferment or your leaven from your sourdough starter. So I have 3 here. I never keep 3. I only have 3 to show you examples. But this one, for example, is really runny. So it's been sitting for a while. You can make a leaven from all of these, okay? It will still activate. So this one is quite runny. It's been sitting for a while. This one is also a little bit runny. So it's been sitting for less time, but it's also been sitting. And then this one is freshly fed just last night. It has beautiful structure, lots of gluten in there, gluten strength in there. And it's, you know, obviously ready to power something optimally. Which one do you think is going to give you the best leaven? Obviously this one is. That being said, you're more than welcome to make a leaven from any of these. The difference is when you make a leaven from this one, you're going to need more flour. You're going to need more food. So if I make my leaven with 150 grams of water and 150 grams of flour and then my 30 grams of this, it's going to give me a very different consistency than what this is going to give me. Does that make sense? So basically, I want a specific consistency. I'm going to show you. I want a specific consistency of my leaven. So if I'm using my ratio, it can't be just a foolproof ratio. So it's a great recipe for when you're doing your leavens for your different sourdough recipes, but it's not foolproof because it always depends on what you're using here. Okay? So if I go ahead and use this one, well, it's going to give me probably a runnier sourdough leaven than if I'm going to use this one. Okay? So that's fine, but you have to keep into consideration that if I make my leaven with this one, with just 150 and 150, it's not going to give me that. It's not going to look like this. Okay? So what I need to keep in mind is I want to look for consistency of my sourdough leaven. So I'm going to make it, I'm going to show you what consistency I'm looking for. If it doesn't give you the consistency you're looking for with this, you need to add more flour. So I know that that doesn't give you a 100% hydration in your leaven, but that's okay. It's better than adding more flour and getting gummy and flat sourdough bread at the end. So I'm going to make one with this and I'm going to make one with this, and I'm going to show you the difference in the consistencies, and I'm going to show you how I add more flour to get the consistency I want. So we're going to use our scale. You can use any scale that you have that has a tare option. We have our 2 different variables. So we have our really soupy starter, which still has some activity, and then we have one that has lots of activity in it. So let's start with our jar. So we're going to tare it to 0, and we're going to put 150 grams of water into the jar. Then we're going to tare back to 0, and we're going to come in here and put 150 grams of flour. And tare it back to 0. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to put 30 grams of our soupy starter. So it's about, I usually don't measure, it's usually about a big spoon. So you have like your little teaspoons and then your big spoons. It's about a big spoon. So that works out. It's about 31 grams there. And then we're just going to stir it up. Okay, and so this gives you like a thick kind of pancake batter, which is fine. This will work. But and this will absolutely work. This is a fine consistency. But it falls off the spoon a little bit easier. I'm going to show you what that looks like for the thick starter. Okay, so we have our water and our flour, and then we're just gonna come in here and take, you can see how much more activity is in this one. So we'll get a big spoonful of that. That's not quite 30 grams. Trying to keep the variables as even as possible. That's exactly 30 grams there. And then we'll stir this up. So you can see already how much harder it is to stir this one, simply because of the activity in the starter. Okay, so this is really what I like to see. This is the consistency that I like for my leaven. That is gonna give you, so you can see how much harder it is for me to stir it, how much thicker the leaven is. So again, this will work. This works fine. But this one is really, really thick. That is a thick, thick, thick starter. So it's hard to see in the video, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is basically your leaven is only as good as your starter, and your dough is only as good as your leaven. So you really want to make sure that you have a really nice, thick, active leaven before you make your dough. And you can make your leaven out of this, that's totally fine. I would just add a tiny bit more flour to this one just to give a little bit more kick. But you know, you want to make it with a relatively active sourdough starter, because that's what's going to give you your activity in your leaven. I mean, you can already see it stretching. This will activate a lot faster than this one. It's just not near as thick. Okay, so that is how I make my leaven. And when we cover them up, just cover them up with the top, and we just leave them on the counter to get active and use all of it in our bread recipe. So coming back to your starter, your leaven is only as good as your starter is, and your dough is only as strong and as structured as your leaven is. Your starter is only as good as your flour. So make sure that you're sourcing a really high quality bread flour or high protein all-purpose flour. I like to keep it at least 13% protein, especially for people who are newer to sourdough. It tends to be, you know, like the sweet spot. So 13% will give you like a nice protein for building your starter from that. When you're mixing up your leaven, you really want to get in there and mix. So you can't over mix this. So the more that you're mixing it up, the more that you're kind of like agitating it, the more you're starting to pre-develop the gluten. So I like to really like give it a really good mix. And then basically what you're looking for is it should be able to go upside down and not fall out. So it's like slowly kind of falling down. This one will fall, like this one's coming right out. Again, this is not a bad leaven. It's just for people who are having issues with their bread, it's really important to focus on protein content in your flour and your leaven. And so if you're having issues with sticky dough, flat bread, gummy bread, underdeveloped bread, all of those things, come back to here. Come right back to your leaven. If you're not able to get a rise and activity like I showed in my leaven, then you want to go back to your flour. What type of flour are you using? And maybe you'll need to switch that up a little bit. So those are just some tips and tricks that you want to keep in mind. Protein content in your flour and a really nice strong active leaven, and you almost always have success with your bread recipe.